Hi everyone, today I'm going to be doing my Cosmere reread review of Mistborn, the first one. I think I should be able to keep this completely spoiler-free. I wasn't sure at first, but I think all of the important things can be said without giving any spoilers, so if you haven't read Mistborn, you should still be able to watch this review. So as you can see from the cover, this book is called Mistborn, except if you look at the title page, it's actually Mistborn, the Final Empire. So I've mentioned this before. What happened is they published the first book of the Mistborn trilogy as Mistborn, the Final Empire, and then they realized that that wasn't a very good title and that calling the first book in a trilogy the Final Empire was kind of weird and confusing, and so they've overall kind of rebranded this book as just Mistborn. I was really excited to do this reread because this was the first Brandon Sanderson book that I ever read. And I read it probably, I think it was almost 10 years ago. Maybe it was 10 years ago exactly. It was either 10 or 11 years ago. I don't know. So when I read it, I was in college. I was trying to get back into fantasy at a time where I hadn't been reading very much fantasy for a few years, and I had sort of been aware of Brandon Sanderson and had heard the name, but this was the first book by him that I picked up. It turns out that this is actually the book that he recommends people start with if they haven't read his works before. I think the reason that he recommends this one is that it is pretty accessible to get into out of all of his books. It's not as hefty as The Way of Kings, but it's a little more of a mature work than Elantris, which I think is a great book, but still has some new writer things in it. So I agree, I think Mistborn is a pretty good place to start if you haven't read any Sanderson before, and it really does showcase a lot of the things that he's known for as a writer. It's kind of funny, I remember pretty clearly the first time I read this book, I was on spring break with my parents. We were on vacation, and when my parents travel, they like to walk a lot. And so when I traveled with them when I was younger, I would usually bring a huge stack of books and park myself somewhere and get through them. And usually I would run through all of my books way before the trip was over. But I have pretty clear memories of reading Mistborn for the first time sitting on a beach, which somehow just seems really incongruous. I'm not sure why. It's because the setting of this book is a little bit dark and gray and ashy and just not very beach-like. And I just don't think of this as being like a beach read type of book, but I guess I have read all sorts of things on beaches in my time. So the pitch for Mistborn and the setup is that once a hero rose to save the world, but he failed, and now that was 1,000 years ago, and we are in the Final Empire, which is controlled by the Lord Ruler, who is not a very nice person, and also might be God. So the Lord Ruler is immortal and all-powerful. Below the Lord Ruler, there is an aristocracy that basically controls everything, and then they control a peasant class called the Ska, who are basically slaves. A lot of them are serfs on plantations, and they are treated very badly and have pretty unpleasant lives. Also, in this world, there is ash falling from the sky. Everything is kind of brown and red. Like, plants are also brown and red, and it's just a pretty grim setting. Mistborn is framed as a heist story, and I think I've seen Sanderson say before when people ask for writing advice that if you want to write a fantasy story that isn't the typical chosen one farm boy prophecy, that a heist can be a really good framework to use. So in this story, you have Kelsier, the thief with a sort of dark, tormented past, who is back for one last job, except that this time the job is to overthrow the Final Empire. And for him, it's a bit of a revenge quest as well. And then he has his ragtag crew and team of associates. Each one has their different specialty, kind of like what you would see in any heist movie. And then you have Vin, the orphan, who is on her first job with them. So in terms of the beats that the story hits, it very much follows a heist story that you would expect, right down to the end where, you know, in a heist story, there is always a twist about how they accomplish the job. And I won't say any more than that about it here, but you can definitely expect that in this book. I think framing this as a heist story was a really deliberate choice that Brandon Sanderson made to make this not your typical fantasy novel, and it probably did seem a bit more different when it came out like 10-15 years ago, but it still works really, really well, and it's funny to have something that has a bit more of the heft of epic fantasy, but the punchiness of a heist story. The first thing you always hear people talk about with Mistborn, although I guess I'm not talking about it first, but it's a really big part of the story, is the magic system. Sanderson is known for his magic systems, and that is especially true in Mistborn. So Brandon Sanderson has Sanderson's laws of magic, which are basically laws he has described about how an author can use magic in a story effectively. Sanderson's first law is that an author's ability to solve something in the story with magic is directly proportional to how well the magic is explained in the story. So Mistborn is really a showcase for Sanderson's first law because the magic is explained very gradually but in great detail. It is kind of like a science. The characters themselves don't always understand everything about it, but they have thought about it and described it in great detail, and so they always are describing it and using it to the best of their ability. And as a reader, throughout this trilogy, you get to learn more and more about the things that the magic system can do, and even in Mistborn Era 2, once it's brought more into the modern era, you get even more things that the magic can do. I really like the fact that a lot of the times the characters themselves are wrong about how the magic works. Like, they'll be very confident about it, but they'll just have a basic misunderstanding about how things are set up or how it actually functions or what rules it obeys. And I think that's really funny because, of course, in the real world, we mess stuff up like that. I mean, not magic, but we misunderstand things about nature and science all the time. That's just part of life. But how often do you see in fantasy series where people just like don't understand everything that the magic can do? Usually they seem to understand it weirdly well and everyone knows the rules even though they haven't studied it. The main magic system explored in the first Mistborn book is Allomancy, which is where magic users can consume and then burn specific metals to get specific abilities. Magic itself is pretty rare, and then most people that do have that ability can only burn a single metal, but there are very, very rare people called Mistborn who have the ability to use all of the metals. So Kelsier and Vin in this book are both Mistborn, and that plays a major role in the story. In this world, only the nobility have Allomancy. That is because the Lord Ruler has forbidden them to have children with the Ska, so basically in order to keep the powers in a way that he can control by having only the aristocracy have those powers. However, despite a lot of consequences and rules and very nasty things being done to the Ska, there are a certain number of people who are a mix of Ska and noble, including most of the important characters in this book. And so they are people that have Allomancy that exist outside of the system. So both Kelsier and Vin are half noble, half Ska, and that is why they have their abilities. There are two other magic systems in the Mistborn series. They also involve the use of metals in slightly different ways. They are feruchemy and hemorrhagy, but a lot of the discovery about what those things are actually happens in this book and throughout the series, so I'm not going to explain in depth how they work right now. You'll have to read the series and find out. A lot of my reactions to rereading the series have to do with how I feel about the characters. Sanderson isn't known for writing dark books particularly, but he does write characters that have been through really dark things, and I think he does express it pretty well. It just somehow the books avoid having like a grimdark tone. That's something I like about his writing. It's not oppressively disturbing, but it doesn't feel like the characters are unaffected by the things that they've gone through in their lives. And I think reading this as a bit of an older reader, I actually appreciate that depth more. I think when I was younger, because you're not being hit over the head with those aspects of darkness as much, it was a little bit, but now I think I sort of felt those things in the characters more. Especially Kelsier. He's a really dark character in some ways and not the greatest guy, even though you really like him. But there are a lot of things about him that are really contradictory. Even among his friends and his crew, he inspires a lot of controversy, and there are a lot of times throughout the books that they are sort of wondering if he is going over the edge with certain things, and they are pointing out the issues with some of his decision making. Out of all the characters who are trying to overthrow the Empire, he is probably the one that has the most personal hatred of the nobility, which is kind of ironic because, like many of the characters, he is half noble himself. Although obviously he's been through some terrible things, even some of his friends can see that darkness in him, and it's definitely something that gets dealt with throughout the book. He's somebody that hasn't necessarily been the greatest person for most of his life and still has some pretty major character flaws, but is kind of trying to be a good person, whether or not he always succeeds at it. I really wanted to go straight from this book into Mistborn, A Secret History, which is a short novella that Sanderson did from Kelsier's point of view. I won't say any more because spoilers, but I'm going to wait and reread the whole trilogy before I read Secret History again, because I think Secret History does have spoilers for the entire Mistborn trilogy. I actually quite liked Vin on this reread. I don't think she's the most original character in terms of she's the orphan thief who is sort of learning more about the world, and she is the character through which we get to learn all about Allomancy and what's going on. So a lot of her role in the story is to learn things. She has her own issues to deal with though, and a lot of them are about basically learning how to be a person and have friends, and the situations that she's grown up in have made her very untrusting, and so she really has to make a choice to change. That's something I like about Sanderson's characters. Kelsier too. The characters are growing and changing, but they are also constantly in these positions where they have to choose what kind of person they want to be. They aren't necessarily forced into a certain direction by the story. There are always points where they have to make a decision. I've heard people complain that Vin as a character is way too overpowered in the first Mistborn book, and I kind of understand the frustration of having the young orphan character who's suddenly really strong and good at magic. On the other hand, Vin does have powerful abilities for a reason that you kind of find out more about later in the series, but also she isn't just automatically good at everything. Like, the strength doesn't always translate into finesse, and she has plenty of issues with things that arise because she is so strong and she feels really confident, but she still has a lot to learn. A character that I really came to appreciate in this reread is Sazed, who is the terrace steward who is basically helping out Vin for a lot of the book, but also has his own secrets and has a pretty important role to play in the story. He's a character who, on first appearances, seems very subservient, and he is from a race that has basically been bred by the Lord Ruler to be subservient. They've been, in their own way, kind of subjugated for a lot of years because the Lord Ruler wants to suppress things about their culture. So he's a character that I didn't used to like as much, even though I know a lot of people love him. And to be fair, he has some plots in some of the later books that I think will probably still drive me crazy. But he's a very interesting character because he is responsible for remembering and preserving all these different dead religions, as well as all sorts of other cultural knowledge. And he is basically always telling the other characters about religions, and he is trying out religions on them to see if there is a belief that they might like to try out. I've mentioned before that Sanderson usually has some sort of exploration of religion and what it means to characters in his books, and that often looks really, really different. So Sazed is the vehicle through which that happens in this book. Sazed's perspective is really about not so much what is true, but what religion and culture mean to a person. His own culture and original religion of that culture has been completely suppressed, so I think he is searching among all these religions to try to find this heritage that his people have lost. I feel like I really understood and empathized with his desire to understand where his people actually came from and more about his heritage. This won't mean much to you if you haven't read the book, but there is one more character in this book that I really love for some reason. I love him throughout all the Mistborn books, and I don't know why, because he gets very little screen time. But Kelsier's brother, Marsh, for some reason, I just think he's such a great character. He is the character that is willing to really do whatever it takes to accomplish the things that he's trying to do, even at very great personal cost, even if he doesn't really get to take credit for what he's doing exactly. That'll make more sense if you've read the book, but it's funny how sometimes a character that isn't that important to the book or doesn't get a lot of screen time becomes a character that you really like. From what I remember, Mistborn 1 is really the most straightforward book in the trilogy in a lot of ways, where the characters are all totally convinced they're doing the right thing, they want to overthrow the Empire, it seems pretty clear what's good and what's bad, and sure, there are some disagreements about tactics, but everyone's on the same page, and then things kind of go downhill from there in the rest of the series. I think Book 1 stands not on its own, but books 2 and 3 are more related to each other than book 1 is to books 2 and 3, if that makes sense. I was surprised. On this reread, I felt like immersion into the world and how things got explained was actually a little bit slower paced. It's probably good if you haven't read a lot of fantasy or you're not used to reading books where you just get thrown in the deep end with things, but I didn't remember it feeling that way before, so I think it's probably just because it's a reread for me, and I've read not only this series, but Mistborn Era 2 and other Cosmere things, and I just already knew a lot of this stuff, so to me, it felt like it took a little while to get rolling with all of that stuff. But I think he explains it very, very well, and by the end of the book, you do feel like you understand how the magic system works. So I complained when I reread Elantris that there was only one important female character, and that she was kind of not like other girls, so that was Serene from Elantris. In some ways, Mistborn suffers from that too. Vin doesn't suffer from the not like other girls thing quite so much. She has both her thief side and she starts to discover her more feminine side, which is something I didn't really mind, but she's really the only woman in this book, except for one other kind of minor character that has a very specific role to play. I think that actually gets addressed in books 2 and 3 of the Mistborn trilogy. There are more female characters that do things, but I'm just really glad that The Way of Kings and a lot of Sanderson's later books just have more female characters in them. And Sanderson has been recently, he's been posting about how he is adapting Mistborn into a screenplay, and I think he has actually made a lot of changes that he's talked about to the plot and characters in that adaptation, including making some more members of the crew female who are originally male in this book, because, as he pointed out, there was really no reason for them not to be. So I'm pointing this out now still because I do see it in his writing, but I also feel like it's something that has really changed in his later books and I feel very happy with in the Stormlight Archive, so I don't think it's a reason not to read his work. It's just something that I'm aware of that is a way that he's grown as a writer. So that's my review of Mistborn number 1. I need to move on to Mistborn 2 and 3 now and try to stay on pace for this Cosmere reread. I feel like I don't remember Mistborn 2 and 3 quite as well as I remembered this book. I do remember the major twists and plot points, but I feel like I might discover even more things that are new to me. So I'm really looking forward to that. So if you'd like to see those reviews when I get to them, as well as other reviews and videos that I'm doing right now, please subscribe.